We have a good friend, and she loves Christmas. This week on Facebook, she began her countdown to the number of days to Christmas. I was rather horrified. I'm not ready to think about such things yet. And to tell you the truth, since she puts everything up on Halloween, the day after Halloween, I'm rather sick of it by the time I would be anyway. But it made me think about how that time of the year, there's certain things that are traditions. And one of them is the showing of Miracle on 34th Street. And that movie came to mind as I was working on today's sermon. As you will recall, it's about a gentleman who looks like the classic Santa Claus that we all know and love. His name is Kris Kringle to boot. And no one believes him that he is actually Santa Claus. And as the movie plays out, the little girl who is most skeptical in the beginning becomes his most ardent supporter. And in fact, he ends up going to court where the judge rules that he must be Santa Claus. But nobody believes him during the course of the movie until the end, except the little girl. I have a feeling that Jesus must have had similar frustrations with the cluelessness of the disciples. We get it here in this story. We get it through the entire Gospel of Mark. In our story today and in the stories that follow in the next chapter, no one believes who Jesus says that he is, the Son of God. He does amazing and dramatic miracles, events that just kind of boggle the mind. And yet no one gets it. Our story this morning is the first of these demonstrations of divine power on the part of Jesus. Jesus stills a storm. And as you heard John read, Jesus is able to control the wind and the sea in a terrible storm, and yet the disciples still don't get who he is. As a matter of fact, they're more horrified that Jesus slept through most of this event than they are of anything else. Jesus asleep in the boat. What is wrong with you, teacher? We're about to die out here. Do something about it. This story is followed by the story of Jesus' healing of a man possessed by demons. And again, the people are amazed, but only the man he heals seems to get it. Oh, except for the demons. They seem to get it. But the disciples, the people following Jesus, nobody gets it. That story is followed by the raising of a little girl from the dead. And as Jesus is on his way to her house, because her father has requested that he come, a woman who has a serious blood disorder touches the hem of his garment and is healed. And people laugh because Jesus turns when this woman touches him and says, "Who touched me?" Now he's in the middle of a crowd. They're like, "We're all touching you." And he says, "No, someone touched me. And I felt the healing power go." Then when he gets to the house of the little girl, he tells everybody that she's asleep, and they all laugh again because they know she's dead and what's wrong with him. And yet he raises her from the dead. They're amazed at the healings. They're entertained by the healings. But they still don't get a sense of who he is or believe that he, in fact, is the Son of God. That story is followed with him going to his hometown and preaching in the synagogue, and they refuse to believe in him. I mean, they've known him all of his life. And so Jesus says to them, prophets are not without honor except in their own hometown and among their own kin and in their own house. Jesus spends an enormous amount of time in the Gospel of Mark trying to convince people of who he is. He must have wondered at some point, what more do I have to do in order to get you to believe that I am who I am? And indeed, the dilemma continues until after the resurrection. Then they finally start to get a clue. Now, I know for some of us, struggling with our faith, our own doubts about it, the traditional things that we've been taught, is sometimes an issue. That we too have to work with what is going on here. What does that mean, you're the Son of God? How do we understand these things? And I guess we can cut ourselves some slack, because after all, if those who witnessed these things, didn't get it, and they were right there with him, then maybe those of us who only have the stories have a little leeway for having trouble believing sometimes what these things are. And by the same token, we have many advantages that they did not have. We have the witness of the four Gospels. They were only experiencing these things one thing at a time. We have 2,000 years plus of history of seeing God's ongoing work in the world. And we have a church history that often demonstrates that the movement Jesus began was not a fly-by-night idea. It was something that was to last. So maybe, just maybe, believing that Jesus is the Son of God could be easier for us. Or maybe it's just that we've inherited the belief and we don't think about it. In light of the events this week in our nation, actually one primary event, sometimes I wonder if believing isn't the easier thing. The harder thing is, does it make a difference in our world? I don't wonder that in a world where a young white man can walk into a church, pray and be at Bible study for an hour with the people there, and then mercilessly gun them down, if believing in Jesus was the Son of God has made much difference in our world. The shooter in Charleston was raised in a Christian church and supposedly a Christian home. As a matter of fact, he belonged to a Lutheran church, an ELCA Lutheran church. But the message of Jesus didn't ever seem to get through. Sadly, he is not alone. The Southern Poverty Law Center's tracking of the sorts of hate groups that teach racism and that influence Dylann Roof has shown that there are a proliferation of these groups throughout the country. Often in the guise of being Christian, these groups offer a gospel of hate that Jesus wouldn't recognize and would certainly repudiate. The disciples thought it was wrong for Jesus to sleep through the storm that terrified them and almost killed them. How asleep during the storm of violence and hatred and racism are we? Now, I know it's easier to think that this is a Southern problem, and having grown up in the South, it is a problem. Or perhaps it's an East Coast problem in those cities where there is just so much poverty. Somehow we like to think Minnesota is different. And yet the Southern Poverty Law Center follows 8 different hate groups here in Minnesota, 3 of them right here in Minneapolis. These include the Aryan Strike Force, a neo-Nazi group called the National Socialist Movement, and a racist skinhead group called the Vinlanders Minnesota. We are not free of this radical hate element here. But beyond this radical fringe of hatred, how do we understand the racism that exists in other ways and that damages our souls and psyches? A Native American friend of mine here in the Twin Cities has told me of being refused communion in Christian churches, including a UCC church, because they didn't think she was Christian because she was Indian. She was born and baptized into a Roman Catholic family and now belongs to the United Church of Christ. And yet they refused her communion. Or an incident I observed at my local library with several groups of teens being, teens. They were doing what kids do, and the idea that you're supposed to be quiet in a library is a whole other thing. But the librarians only reprimanded and threatened to expel the black teens. They didn't say anything to the white groups of teenagers that were there. I thought I lived in a better place. I could go on, but I'm sure that you can also think of experiences where you have witnessed racism. Are we asleep during this storm? Are we pretending and fooling ourselves that it doesn't exist in our midst? Are we willing to awaken? Are we willing to calm the raging storm and work for healing in our society? Work for change in our society? Are we willing to acknowledge what's going on and look for ways to be healers of this ill that stalks our land? Over the past few days, I have seen the phrase in blog posts and Facebook posts. I've made it myself. The phrase, "Lord, have mercy." It's often a response we make in response to events like Charleston. It's actually based in an ancient prayer of the church, asking God's mercy and forgiveness. It's usually sung in the Greek, interestingly. Kyrie eleison, Christe eleison, Kyrie eleison. Lord, have mercy. Christ, have mercy. Lord, have mercy. It's a good place for us to start as we look for healing in this land of ours. May it be so. May God have mercy, and may God give us strength. Amen.